Thank you very much for having me here. I'm actually quite thrilled to be here addressing an audience at the Urban Design Group. This is a real honor, and it's nice to be able to support the work that the group is doing, which I think is very excellent. My name is Joseph Heathcott, and I'm from the United States, from New York City, but I'm here for an academic year as a visiting Fulbright scholar at the University of the Arts and as a visiting fellow at the London School of Economics. And in New York, I teach at the New School, where I actually chair urban studies at the New School, which includes urban design and other fields. And I'll actually talk about that in a little bit, what we're actually doing there. My remarks tonight will be of more of a general nature, although I will delve into some specifics. I know that our next speaker will have some very, very specific projects that she'll be talking about, which I'm really looking forward to hearing about. But I want to keep some of my remarks somewhat general so we can sort of create a framework for the discussion about the interrelationship of urban design and anthropology. I'll talk about three things in my few minutes that I have. That is, I'll talk about knowledge, that is the conditions of knowledge that support the intersection or the enjoyment of urban design and anthropology, or as I often will say, urban design and social sciences more generally. I'll talk about the program or programming around this intersection. That is what we've been trying to do at the New School, and I would certainly be interested to hear from others of you what your experience at various universities or firms here has been in trying to enjoin these very, very distinct domains of knowledge production and practice. And then pedagogy. I will talk a little bit about some of the kind of pedagogical approaches and projects that we've been working on and that I've been doing with students in New York. So first, to talk a little bit about the conditions of knowledge that support or underlie these two fields. Of course, you know, in general, anthropology, architecture, urban design exist within a world of disciplines, a world in which knowledge is a kind of function of disciplinary technologies and the organization of these sort of understandings within disciplinary frameworks. This obviously is an old story. It emerges out of the Middle Ages, certainly with the kind of reconstitution of the classical, the way the classical world divided up knowledge, and this was reinterpreted through the kind of early modern period, and finally settled into the modern period as a series of disciplines that ask certain kinds of questions in certain kinds of ways. Anthropology, as one of these kind of disciplinary techniques or technologies, really emerged in the middle to the late 19th century as a kind of order-making proposition, a kind of way to understand and order the world. It was part of a much broader attempt to collect, to recover, to know the world. This was sort of embedded in a sort of imperial project to understand the world that the empire was encountering, and that the kind of seat of modernity, the metropole, was sort of out there encountering in the world. And so it's very closely related to the scientific impulse to classify, to collect, to taxonomize, and to organize knowledge in certain ways. So anthropology has, like many disciplines, has this kind of background in a sort of vertical, hierarchical, modernist structure of knowledge organization, a kind of will to discipline knowledge in certain ways, certain frameworks. And so disciplines ask particular questions about the world, right? And so the way that the disciplines ask the questions often frames the nature of the research itself, right? So anthropology asks questions about the world in one way, and so then it therefore understands the world in a certain way. Sociology, history, architecture, other fields do the same. That's what disciplinary frameworks do. That's what they're about. Urban design, as a practice, as a kind of field of both intellectual and practical endeavor, really emerges. I know there's a fashion, and perhaps in the United States, I'm not sure if it's true here. There's a fashion in the United States to say that urban design was invented at Harvard in 1956, which I always think is really funny. Those are my architect friends, trying to be historical. It's very cute. But it's not the case, of course. Urban design has a long pedigree. It stretches back into the 18th century. It really gained a lot of ground in the 19th century when architects and other sort of thinkers and shapers of the city began to think beyond the envelope of the building itself and really began to look out at what surrounds the building and how the building is actually situated in space within the city, how the city itself is organized, what the relationship between buildings and arteries of movement are. All these kinds of questions really arise in the 19th century, and architecture and urban design become disciplines that are like anthropology, like history, like sociology, like politics and economics. They become disciplines that are part of a disciplinary sort of mechanism or framework or technology of reproduction in universities. That is, they have degrees, they have curriculum, they have requirements, they have all these things that sort of guard are gateways to the consumption and production of knowledge in the field. And so, both anthropology and urban design have these kinds of longer pedigrees that stretch well back through the modern era to the 18th and 19th century. Both of these disciplines, urban design and anthropology, they're quite different. They're quite distinct. They're very far apart from each other in certain ways, and we'll talk about that and what the challenges are of bringing them together. Certainly, in their practice, they have often had some darker undersides, and I think that old sins, of course, can cast long shadows, and we're still living with some of the legacies of the less savory practices of anthropology and urban design both. And that actually presents a constant challenge, I think, for us when we think about enjoining these two disciplines or fields. Certainly with the kind of modern expression of anthropology as embodied in the work of Malinowski, the impulse to primitivize people, the obsession with the primitive, the kind of privileging of a kind of Western gaze or point of view, all the kind of things that we think about in terms of the kind of modern classic anthropological approach to producing knowledge. Urban design, certainly in its kind of high modern expression with the CIAM and with Le Corbusier, the problematic God's eye view of the world, the kind of normative claims about human nature and human behavior that underlie the whole concept of the minimum existence and the organization of urban space into these kinds of new modern facilities and systems. So there are all kinds of great accomplishments of these disciplines, but also lots of problems. And it's important to remember that we still live with a lot of the legacies of these challenges today. But of course, like in all disciplines, those kind of the modern project in both anthropology and urban design have been greatly challenged, right, in the 20th century, in the late 20th century. Not the least of which in the lower right-hand corner, of course, would be a figure like Jane Jacobs, who took on the whole sort of discipline of modern urban design and architecture, at least certainly in New York City, but much more broadly. She was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation in the 1950s and 60s to study the effects of modern architecture on neighborhoods, and wrote one of the most scathing critiques of modernism that has ever been lobbed at it, the death and life of great American cities, or in terms of anthropology, the whole post-colonial movement that was really not, I don't want to say originated with, but certainly was articulated and in many ways jump-started by figures like Frantz Fanon in the left. And so we now live, fortunately, in a period in which both urban design and architecture have come to grips with many of their fundamental problems, many of the fundamental challenges. We now understand the critiques of them, and we're trying to, I think, work through where we are in terms of our relationship with these two disciplines, and especially those of us who sort of work in both worlds. And yet, we still live in a world in which these disciplines provide a kind of siloing of knowledge, a kind of siloing of the understanding of the world. This is very much the case in the structure of the university, which often to me really does feel like a grain silo, and the different departments kind of represent this sort of fiefdom of knowledge, this sort of way of this kind of modern impulse to divide knowledge in certain ways. Now, we're certainly trying to get beyond that, but in many respects, the university is still organized this way. And it's even in the architecture of our universities, obviously, where things are located, how the space is organized on the campuses, what buildings are with what. I mean, or how many have ever been to a school where anthropology was in the art school? Anybody? Right. Yeah, one. Okay. Woohoo, two. All right. So something's happening there. That's exciting. So, the sort of location, the distanciation or co-location of these different kinds of domains of knowledge, production, and consumption have a lot to do with how we think about the enjoyment of these things. The actual job of the faculty member is also a barrier to the enjoyment of different disciplines, and so the actual way that the reward structure is organized for faculty members reproduces this kind of siloed knowledge, where research is normed by a whole set of peer review institutions that really kind of manage knowledge in a certain kind of direction, and punish knowledge production that falls outside of certain kinds of boundaries. And so what does this mean for the practice of disciplines and disciplinary research? Well, there might be a Mac PC translation issue here, so bear with me if it starts to look a little wonky. I'm going to apologize for that. Disciplines, by and large, are still organized along this basic structure. We have a discipline that has at its heart or at its root a kind of methodological orthodoxy, and that orthodoxy is fairly closely policed by the ordinating bodies that structure the discipline, the professional associations, the journals, whatever, the accrediting bodies, things like that. That methodological orthodoxy then disciplines the nature of the problems or queries that are made by the discipline. Right? So that you don't generally ask questions outside of the discipline. The discipline is really, really part of that kind of larger orthodoxy of methodology. This is very much true of certainly the social sciences, I would argue, are some of the worst offenders in this respect. I think scientists have sort of gotten way beyond this model. Scientists have, since the 20s, been rocketing beyond this limited model. But in the social sciences, particularly economics, political science, history, anthropology, we still sort of work within this basic kind of framework. So for anthropology, it might look like this. For architecture, and I'm using architecture now instead of urban design because in most respects, 90 to 95% of all urban design programs really are ensconced or housed within architecture programs around the world, and there aren't that many of them, by the way. And so anthropology might look like this. In the middle, architecture might look like that. But at the root, they're still asking certain kinds of questions about the world. Now, that doesn't mean we haven't moved beyond this. I mean, certainly we're trying to break out of these frameworks, and I'll talk about that. But this is the kind of basic challenge that we face, and this is actually one of the main difficulties when I work with students and faculty at the New School of trying to get people to really think beyond these kinds of siloed boundaries, and I'll talk about that. Another challenge, of course, is that anthropology and architecture regard themselves in very different kind of ways vis-a-vis their approach to the production of knowledge. So anthropology thinks of itself as an empirical discipline, and architecture as a normative discipline. I, of course, would argue that neither are neither. Does that make any sense? I don't really know. That anthropology has, of course, both normative empirical dimensions, and so does architecture. But that divide of the normative empirical really does actually, that's one of the things that emerges when I'm teaching in the classroom. That's one of the things that really emerges first and foremost between students that come out of architecture and students that come out of social science. It's really interesting. So what we're trying to do, and I think what a lot of us are interested in, because if you're attracted to urban design, and if you're interested in the idea that urban design might have a relationship with social science, then you are, by the very fact of that, interested in transcending these kinds of disciplinary boundaries and these silos. then you're trying to think about what it might mean, I think with me, and I invite you to think with me, what it might mean to think in a transdisciplinary way. And I don't necessarily mean interdisciplinary, I really mean transdisciplinary. That is, how might we begin to think about the structuring and organization of knowledge, the production of knowledge, in a way that doesn't necessarily move beyond disciplines altogether and leave them behind, but it reorganizes the role of the disciplines in the production of knowledge. And so that instead of the discipline framing the kinds of questions we ask, what we're really interested in, we do have a kind of Mac PC problem here, but anyway, is we're really trying to switch that and say, let's begin to think about asking questions from the basis of the object of study, right? So that instead of saying, I'm an anthropologist, or I'm a sociologist, or I'm a political scientist, so I ask questions about politics, I ask questions about human social relationships in small groups, I ask questions about the nature of building design and things like that, that we start with something like the city as our point of departure, that the city is actually what disciplines us in terms of thinking about how we produce knowledge, how we approach thinking about the world. And so the city disciplines the problems and the queries, and that leads to a methodological heterodoxy, because of course, as we very quickly, I think all of you will realize this, as we very quickly realize, the city is vastly too complex. The complexity of this city rapidly outstrips our ability to understand it through any one disciplinary lens, right? The city is, in reality, of course, the city is just kind of an unknowable creature. It's an unknowable, big, amorphous thing, and we pretend like we can know it because we have these sort of frameworks, and we approach it in that way, which is kind of exciting. I kind of like that the idea of the city is kind of ultimately unknowable because it's what keeps me going, keeps me getting out of bed, that sort of thing, keeps me teaching. But it gives us what we then need are lots of tools, lots of ways to try to understand the city. And then that opens up, of course, not just the methodologies that we can use, but the actual products that we can create. If the city is complex and if we have lots of different tools, then we can produce lots of different things, not just books, not just articles, maybe not even just buildings, but all sorts of things. And social scientists and that is anthropologists and urban designers can then begin to work together on a range of different kinds of products, and not just the kinds of things that they're used to doing from their graduate student days. And so this sets up a different set of feedback loops, right? Those kind of dotted lines that connect things. That is that there's a feedback loop that then begins to get generated between the kind of problems you ask and the kinds of things that you're producing, research and exhibits and that sort of thing. There's a feedback loop that begins to develop between the object of your study, that is in this case the city, and the methodologies that you actually are bringing to bear on it. That is, you begin to realize that you don't have all the tools you need, so that you then go in search of other tools. And a lot of this is made possible because really since the 1960s there has been a kind of new intellectual revolution, and I don't want to really get into this too much, but there's been what we glibly call an information revolution. It's more than that. It's deeper than that. It's not quite an information revolution, but information is one part of this deeper revolution. That includes systems thinking, includes cybernetics, includes multiple points of overlapping contact and web thinking, all those sorts of things that begin to characterize what we have again glibly called a postmodern intelligence, or a different kind of intelligence, a kind of post-structural postmodern intelligence, and that we begin to then see the organization and distribution of information and knowledge in a very different way, right? We begin to move from this idea of the vertically organized and centrally distributed, the distributionist sort of understanding of knowledge, or the city, for example, that is, the kind of one point of generation and then dispersal mode, to this new mode of information production and consumption, which is polymorphous, which is ethereal, which is point-to-point, which involves multiple iterations and new developments of feedback. And I would argue that these are very important developments for and the context within which we can begin to understand the power of the enjoyment of urban design and anthropology. This has real significant implications. This kind of change in the way we think about knowledge and knowledge production has very deep implications for what we think of the city, because we no longer really think, I would argue, in terms of a city that can be easily or closely modeled in any kind of simplistic way. Remember these, some of you recognize these diagrams. You guys recognize these diagrams? These are kind of the classic kind of organizing diagrams of how the city is structured. The Burgess concentric zone model, the Hoyt sectoral model, and ultimately to the Harrison-Ullman multiple nuclei model. These are sort of comforting sort of ways in which we try to apprehend the city and organize the city and represent it in one way or another. And we've moved away from this in many ways, this idea that the city is all about a center point and then a gradient out from the center that has really kind of dominated urban studies and urban design thinking for a long time, to a notion that the city is actually a kind of rhizomic structure that has multiple centers and multiple points of dispersal and organization. This looks like Sim City, but it's actually real. This is Mexico, outside of Mexico City, a suburban development there. Actually quite lovely in some ways. But, where's the center? I mean, where's the center of Mexico City? Where's the center of Los Angeles? Where's the center of where I live, which is Queens, New York? I don't know. I have no idea. And so we begin to imagine the city as this much more complex beast, this crazily complex, this intricately organized rhizomic structure with multiple centers that compete, multiple centers that collude, multiple interstices and margins that are important to understand. So that's the kind of condition of knowledge I'd suggest that we're working within right now when we begin to think about the enjoyment of urban design and urban studies. Now, urban design and anthropology.